Hey folks, thanks for being here and welcome back. And a special welcome to everybody that's liked and subscribed to the channel since the last video about Mark McCandlish, because my channel's like 4 times bigger now. It's ridiculous. Thank you so much. Anyway, what's this about? Well, according to the Pentagon in the latest AARO report, every single encounter with UFO or UAP by humans all through history can all be explained very, very easily. So easily, in fact, that they just decided not to at all. And also, they've decided to discount every historical account prior to the 2004 Tic Tac encounter. Again, for no real reason. So, frankly, I just didn't think that was good enough. There's such a rich history of cases and interactions with UFOs and the unknown that it's ludicrous to pretend that none of that happened. So what I've done is I have looked at 100 years of UAP history, leading up to the 2017 article in the New York Times, because that's when I know a lot of people got into this hobby, investigation, curse, call it whatever you want. So what I've done is charted it all out with some of the most common sightings. I've focused mainly on things involving craft. So, if you've got any cases that you think would be cool to add, or points of interest that I think would benefit it, then please let me know in the comments, because my intention is to create a sort of community study guide, essentially. So in the links in the description of this video, I'm going to put the actual presentation itself. But yeah, if you let me know anything in the comments that you think should be added, hopefully it'll grow and grow and grow, and we can all have a bit of a useful resource. And maybe Arrow might use it next time they haven't done their homework. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Let's not waste any more time and let's get into it. Just before we dive into the timeline itself, whilst you're seeing these cases, I want you to consider this word. This is a word that Jacques Vallée has used to describe the phenomena as his kind of best description of how it acts, and that is absurd. Utterly or obviously senseless, illogical or untrue, contrary to all reason or common sense, laughably foolish or false, an absurd explanation. Keep that in mind, and the elephant in the room of this UAP study is the woo, or the absurdity. But if you consider it a factor rather than a problem, then I think we might learn something more. So I thought a good case to start with would be the 1933 crash recovery from Magenta in Italy. If this seems familiar, it's because David Grush mentioned it in his testimony to Congress. In this account, Axis forces recovered a crashed figure-8 shaped craft in Magenta in Italy during World War II. They delivered it to the Vatican for safekeeping. However, as World War II was coming to a close and the Vatican could anticipate that the US and Allied forces would shortly be taking over, they delivered it to them as a goodwill gesture. In 1934, an egg-shaped, brightly lit craft was seen floating in the sky above Pennsylvania. In 1936, onlookers described an orange ball of fire zigzagging and moving erratically over the Basque region. In 1938, voiced by Orson Welles, the incredible radio drama War of the Worlds appeared, first bringing the idea of invaders from Mars and space conquest into the homes of many listeners. And in 1940, the first of the many Foo Fighters accounts took place, where Allied bomber crews, I think they were Bristols, but that probably just being overly specific, started seeing luminous glowing balls of light that would shadow their bomber squadrons over mainland Europe. These sightings would continue for another 5 years, but the first of these was in 1940. In 1940, lights were seen in the skies above Japan. Red, green and white objects were seen to be swirling and moving in figure-8 patterns by several dozen witnesses on the ground below. Shortly later in 1941, 13 new stars were seen to appear in the skies above California, where witnesses called in mentioning that they were moving in a very similar fashion, although these lights were described as white rather than multicoloured. In 1942, what's probably my favourite UAP case of all time took place, which is now known as the Battle of Los Angeles. Tensions were high in the US, expecting the Japanese to attack from the coast at any time. So when, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a large orange object floated in from the coast, it set nerves on end, and the city defences opened up, firing 1,400 shells. The naval bases and naval yards also opened up with their anti-aircraft fire. So the amount of flak and fire being let rip into the sky over the city must have been incredible. The fire continued for 2.5 hours before the object, which was completely unaffected by the flak and bullets, floated off over the mainland and then disappeared from radar. Following a successful July test at the Trinity site, in August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, effectively ending the Second World War. That same month, just 20 miles away from the Trinity test site, an avocado-shaped craft crashed. Its inhabitants and the subsequent crash retrieval were observed by 2 farmers' sons. This is featured in Jacques Vallée's book. In June of 1947, the now very famous Kenneth Arnold saw 9 craft and described their movement as like a saucer skips on water. This was then misquoted, creating the term flying saucers. And this is also pretty much the first point in history that a flying saucer is observed. July 1947, the crash occurred at Roswell, New Mexico, where either wreckage from a saucer-shaped craft, as reported initially by the press and Air Force, or a weather balloon, as subsequently reported by the Air Force, were recovered to Wright-Patterson Air Base. In May of 1950, some of the most famous and divisive photographs of flying saucers were taken outside the house of Paul and Evelyn Trent in McMinnville. In 1951, future Apollo astronaut Gordon Cooper would have the first of many UFO encounters from the seat of his Saberjet whilst out on an exercise, where he saw a ball of light moving with incredible speed far beyond anything that man could produce. He would go on to become a great voice and public spokesperson for the disclosure movement. August 1956, at RAF Bentwaters in the UK, a Venom was scrambled and later chased by a ball of light after attempting to fire its weaponry at it. In November of 1957, above Kirtland Air Force Base, a glowing egg-shaped craft performed an extreme display of manoeuvrability, witnessed by several ground crew and captured on radar. This investigation was later featured in Project Blue Book. In 1961, one of the most extraordinary UFO encounters of all time occurred, with Joe Simonton, a local farmer, witnessing a saucer craft land on his farm. The occupants then got out with an empty jug and gestured to it to be filled with water. Upon returning with a full jug of water, the occupants then gave Joe pancakes made from buckwheat. He kept a couple as evidence for when the investigators came after he reported it. But interestingly, from the old fairy stories, it mentioned that if you were in good favour with the fairies, they would give you buckwheat pancakes. Just another example of the absurdity of this field. In September 1961, another extraordinary case and the first recorded abduction case, that of Betty and Barney Hill, who were abducted whilst driving home. They have been studied intensely under hypnotherapy and lie detector tests and never found to be telling lies. And I really recommend listening to the audio tapes of their interviews, which are on YouTube. I'll put a link below in the description. During the landmark 1965 Gemini 6 mission, wherein 2 NASA vessels met in space for the first time, a UFO also appeared to observe the occasion. It was said to have lingered outside the craft for that long that all the astronauts could think to do was play the harmonica to it over the intercom. In 1965, 350 Australian schoolchildren and teachers witnessed a flying saucer flying over the playground in Westall, Australia. Scorch marks were later found on the ground where it was reported to have landed, and signs of radioactivity were detected. In 1967, above Malmstrom Air Force Base in the US, Robert Salas reports that an orange glowing ball of light appeared and later disabled all of their ballistic missiles. I'm really skimming over this one, but there is a huge amount of information out there about this case. Plus, it was featured in the original Disclosure Project. July 1969 saw the successful landing of the Eagle module on the Moon by the Apollo team. 1969 also, President Jimmy Carter saw a UFO whilst visiting Oklahoma. He reported seeing a very bright green light moving around erratically and changing colours before vanishing. And in 1974, John Lennon reported seeing a flying saucer from his New York apartment. In 1976, the now famous Turanian incident occurred, where an F-4 Phantom was scrambled to intercept some balls of light. But as soon as the jet got close to its target, all of its systems were disabled until the object moved away from the vehicle. Also in 1979, in the first incident of its type, a passenger jet was forced to make a landing at an airport in Valencia in Spain. A fighter jet was scrambled to intercept the UFO, but again, as soon as it came close, its systems were temporarily disabled. In 1980, in La Jolla, Peru, another fighter plane engaged a UFO, this time an Su-22. Hundreds of witnesses saw this encounter. In 1980, the UK was host to one of the weirdest UFO accounts of all time, taking place over the course of approximately 12 to 13 days were the events of Rendlesham Forest. Now, there are several accounts, and I don't honestly believe that all of them are accurate or factual. And I think perhaps even some of them have been manufactured to cover up the factual or interesting parts of it. But needless to say, it began with lights in the forest, it ends with landed craft and interfaces with people's consciousness, and it's certainly worthy of more investigation. And in 1984, the Hudson Valley in the US had mass sightings of boomerang shapes and large saucer-shaped craft covered in lights, with over 9,000 witness reports coming in over a 3-year period. In 1986, a Japanese cargo plane flying over Alaska was shadowed by 3 UFOs, one of which was twice the size of an aircraft carrier and shaped like 2 bowls stacked on top of each other. The other 2 seemed to be accompanying it. 1987 saw the Gulf Breeze sightings with several photographs, one of which I've actually seen firsthand, which is awesome, but none more famous than this one taken by Ed Walters, photographed a large disc shape covered in lights and the reflection of the light on the road. This photograph has been tested several times and not been found to be fake. However, I'm going to go out on a limb. I do think Ed Walters was the victim of a discrediting campaign, as an old property that he had lived in, a few years later they found a paper model looking like the subject of this photograph in his garage. Obviously, no one can say whether it's true or not, but I feel if you were looking to discredit somebody after they'd moved out of a property, that would be a very easy way to do it. 1988 saw a large triangle appear over a Welsh town, significant as this seemed to be the start of the huge prevalence of black triangle sightings. Also unusual that these triangles don't seem to have any lights. In 1989, whistleblower Bob Lazar went public with his story of working at the underground facility S4 in the now notorious Area 51. Via the legendary George Knapp, he went on air and told of his employment and the project that he was working on, which was a back-engineered flying saucer. 1990, Calveen in Scotland, a group of hikers saw a huge black diamond-shaped craft with a Harrier flying over it in the hills above Calveen. Now, I personally I'm reasonably sure that this was an American vehicle used in the Gulf War, but either way, it's still a UFO for now. In 1990, this fantastic photograph was taken, which has never been debunked, in Belgium, where 143 people reported large black triangular craft either hovering silently or moving with no inertia with incredible speed, with glowing tips on their wings and a large red light in the middle. In 1992, the now infamous Catalina Island was the host of a huge sightings. Sightings have been recorded here since 1966, but this seems to be one of the most dramatic, with 200 objects rising out of the water before moving off with incredible speed into the distance. This would later be the site of the Tic Tac report by David Fravor as well. In 1994, a fantastic encounter at the aerial school in South Africa, where 54 school children during their break saw a UFO and some accompanying craft land. The occupants got out and communicated with the children telepathically. They were very quickly studied by the Harvard psychologist John Mack, who could only conclude that they were telling the truth. In an event which is somewhat overshadowed now by the Phoenix Lights a few years later, in Ottawa, they had a very similar sighting in 1994, where between 3 and 5 balls of white light were seen hovering over the town for several hours. There is an audio tape on YouTube of a call from the police to the local air traffic control saying that they'd had over 60 calls at the time of their call to them. And the radar operator then spots this huge return on his screen, and it's a very, very entertaining listen. I recommend it. 1996, the Varginha incident occurred, which is the subject of a fantastic documentary by James Fox, where a whole town witnessed a cigar-shaped craft billowing flame and smoke crash, and then allegedly some of its inhabitants were witnessed in the town. One guard tried to apprehend one and later died of a mystery infection. Again, a fantastic account worthy of much deeper investigation. So to 1997 with the now very famous Phoenix Lights incident, where amongst others Kurt Russell and lots of residents of Phoenix, Arizona saw a giant delta wing triangle or group of lights pass slowly over their heads for several hours. The governor tried to make a mockery of it during a press conference and later came out to say that he himself had witnessed it. In 2000, another triangle sighting from Illinois, where 4 different groups of police officers called in with hundreds of civilian accounts witnessing a triangular UFO for over 4 hours. In 2001, the Whistleblower Disclosure Project headed by Dr. Stephen Greer took place, where he led a team of whistleblowers, witnesses and veterans in an event in the National Press Club. Also in the picture there is Mark McCandlish, who my previous video is based on. After appearing overnight in a field in Wiltshire, UK, this magnificently detailed crop circle was photographed in 2001. Now, whilst crop circles had been photographed since the early 80s, this is a particularly detailed and intricate one, which shows very, very, very little evidence of being fakeable. Incidentally, the Queen of England was a huge fan of crop circles and reportedly used to send her aides out to take photos of them when there were fresh reports in the morning. Also, there has been 350 sightings of crop circles since 2005, so this is very much an ongoing anomalous event. In 2004, the Tic Tac encounter appeared, which I'm sure you're all aware of. There's huge amounts of videos and interviews out there about this, but David Fravor and Alex Dietrich, with their backseat officers, investigated an anomalous radar return which turned into an air-to-air encounter with a Tic Tac shaped UFO. In 2006, at 4:15, 12 different witnesses and ground crew reported a large disc hovering silently above the control tower in Chicago Airport. There was no footage taken of it and there was no confirmation, but all of the ground crew were calling from different areas of the airport which led to the air traffic controller then making lots of service calls. Some of those are on YouTube and well worth a listen. In 2007, over the Channel Islands near the UK, pilot Ray Bowyer and the crew of a separate plane altogether both reported seeing two white cigar or tic-tac shaped objects over the English Channel. It seems that water and these tic-tac shaped craft are synonymous with each other. In 2011, over Lafayette in Boulder County, residents reported seeing three glowing orange orbs forming the perfect shape of a triangle. In 2011, this is one of my favourite cases because the video evidence is so convincing. Over the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, there is lots of video evidence from separate sources and different angles of a ball of light flying directly down over the top of the building, hovering there for some time, and then with a flash of light, flying back up with immense speed. Certainly nothing that our technology would be able to handle at the time. 2015 is when the events as documented by Ryan Graves took place, with multiple tic-tac shaped or cube within a sphere objects being picked up on F-18 radar as their infrared systems were being upgraded. In 2017, the now legendary article Glowing Auras and Black Money was published in the New York Times by Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Keane and Helene Cooper. This shone the spotlight on the Pentagon's secret investigation into the UAP field and added immense credit and validation to followers of the subject, leading to the coming forward of whistleblowers such as Ryan Graves and David Fravor and hosts of others, hopefully to follow. We did a great interview with Ralph on the UAP Files podcast, so I'll pop a link to it underneath. He really went into detail about what led to the article coming out and how he feels it stood the test of time. You made it. Well done. So hopefully that wasn't too dry for you and you found something interesting or entertaining in there. Now, in the next section of the video, I've gone a little further. So what I've done is look at around 200 different UFO reports, break them down by decade and group them by type of craft. So whether it was orbs or bright lights or triangles or that sort of thing. So now would be a great time for you to pause the video, go and get yourself a cup of tea or whatever you fancy. Drop me a like if you're enjoying it so far, and then we will get into some heavy data analysis. Okay, so from the couple of hundred accounts that I looked at, these are the ones from the 30s. There was that crash retrieval in Italy of the figure 8 shaped craft, but the rest were mainly bright lights or spherical or egg shaped craft, no cigars or anything like that at this time. In the 40s, prior to the Kenneth Arnold sighting in 1947, where the flying saucer became a household name, there'd been no mention of any saucer-shaped craft in any of the sightings that I saw. There were mainly bright lights in the sky, but the cigar and the spherical egg are still there in a couple. In the 50s, this was definitely the decade of the flying saucer, with over 50% of them being saucer-shaped objects, bright lights taking a close second place. In the 60s, it seemed that the saucers were starting to decrease, but in actual fact, it was still very prevalent. It was just that there were more sightings of spherical and egg-shaped stuff and the bright lights, but still maintaining the same ratio. The 70s was definitely the time of the triangle, which led on into the 80s and 90s, but this is where they started. It was, as you'll see here, there were more sightings of triangles in the 70s than there were flying saucers or bright lights, but it was still quite a balanced ratio. The 80s was definitely a time of bright lights, although they seem synonymous with sometimes people seeing a light in the sky which then turns into a solid craft. They do seem to have been something which has remained relatively consistent since the earliest reports. In the 90s, very much triangular craft with still some saucers, a good balance, but as you'll see in my video about black triangles, I think there was quite a revolution in terms of technology at that time, with the US military having some black triangular craft used in the Gulf War. This final graph shows the decades along the bottom with the types of craft and the number of sightings along the left-hand side. So just to show you the trends and how they would change by year. So the green one at the bottom, for example, is triangular craft. There were none up until the 70s, and then it jumped up to 43 sightings that I saw. The purple line is bright lights, which has always been there in the mix and stayed relatively consistent, only dropping down by the prevalence of other types being reported. The grey line that you can see there is flying saucers. So again, nothing really before 1947-48, and then having a good 20 years of being the most popular type of sighting before being overtaken by the triangle. The final one was egg or spherical or avocado shaped craft like the Trinity crash, which you can see quite early on were quite prevalent, but then really sort of dropped away and are now very rarely seen. Although things like the Mosul orb and various other metallic spheres are still very much in current news. So what can we learn from the data so far? Well, the most obvious thing is that every roughly 10 to 15 years, the most commonly sighted shapes changes. So why would that be? Well, an obvious answer would be technology creep. If you imagine, for example, how much phones have changed in the last 20 years, or how much our flying machines have changed since the first flight in 1910, you can see a massive variety of shape and design. However, what I think is a counter argument to that is that as a design is refined and improved on, the overall shape of it will change less and less. Crocodiles haven't evolved in 60 million years, for example. Those early mobile phones that were all these wacky designs have all ended up sharing the most effective design, which is the sort of blank tablet thing that we see today. Same with cars. So anything capable of performing with the extreme abilities that these UAP seem to do, you would imagine would not need to go through such a drastic refining process as to make them go from a ball of light to a flying saucer, a big triangle. That is, of course, presuming that they're all the same phenomena. A theory that I like to think about is how the phenomena seems to present itself as impossible, but just probable. So what I mean is that, for example, in the 1950s, when we'd got mainly prop-based propulsion and the odd jet engine, to see a flying saucer with no exhaust sort of wobbling the way that they did, you could imagine, with the talk of science fiction and Tesla and whatnot, that it could be floating, and how would it float? And so it makes you think, well, that can't be us, but how's that possible? It's almost like a carrot and stick inspiration. The same with David Fravor when he encountered the Tic Tac. He was flying an FA-18, which is, at the time, one of the most advanced planes on the planet. And yet he was outperformed by something with no wings, no engines, no cockpit, no control surfaces whatsoever. So again, by our standards, that would be impossible with our technology. But by the performance of the craft, it would inspire somebody to think, okay, so how do I make this? And that seems to be a fundamental characteristic of how the phenomena interacts with us. It's very experiential and it's very ridiculous. And I use that word on purpose because something like, for example, the case where a flying saucer gave a farmer some buckwheat pancakes. I mean, on paper, you can imagine, yep, they need food on there, they're going to share their rations. But to a wider sort of scientific study, that's absolutely, it's ridiculous. It's like the craziest fairy story that you can imagine. But to that farmer who is there holding a pancake, it's tangible and it's practical and it's believable. The same with Betty and Barney Hill. It's been said by Jesse Michaels that a couple of weeks prior to their episode, The Outer Limits aired, which featured aliens with slanty eyes going around the sides of their head and silver suits, which is almost the way that Betty and Barney described their encounter. But was it presenting itself in a way that they could interpret rationally, almost a simulation to place them in? This was the thinking of John Mack, Harvard psychologist. Towards the end of his life, he came to the conclusion that all of the people that he'd studied, the one thing that they had in common, and he specialized in abduction cases predominantly and investigated the Ariel School incident, was that all of the people involved had had an experience. That he couldn't vouch for the technical side and the complete accuracy, but of all of the people that he spoke to, they all spoke with complete honesty and were recalling something in a way that seemed very honest and legitimate. A series of events which support this theory, I think, are the 1896 and 1897 airship sightings over mainland USA. This has been mentioned by Grant Cameron in his theory of WOW, which my theories are very, very much aligned with, and on the Think Anomalous YouTube channel. So have a look at that. But also, if you Google it, you can see all of the original newspaper articles. It's fantastic. So in culture at that time, the idea of an airship was acceptable, and it was in fiction. So Jules Verne was writing the story Robert the Conqueror. Thomas Edison was showing patents and pictures of people in winged suits. Let's not forget this was around 10, 11 years before the first powered flight. But beginning in 1896 in Sacramento, and over the next 12 months, there were hundreds of sightings by up to 1,000 witnesses at a time. There was 1,200 articles published in 400 different newspapers in 41 states and 6 Canadian provinces. So it's fair to say that something definitely happened. And in those accounts, they would say that they would see a great dirigible or an egg-shaped craft with a propeller on each corner and a searchlight front and back. Sometimes even with a rope and anchor, and people would hear voices in the clouds. Ridiculous by today's standards, but is that the tic-tac of the 1890s? Something which is beyond their technical capability, but sort of imaginable in a fantasy setting. In these accounts, not only did they fly over towns for hours at a time, rocking as if a ship was being affected by waves, there are accounts of anchors being dropped and the inhabitants coming and interacting and asking for water or rations and saying that they were travellers from Mars. It was very much the theme in the newspapers that they were imminently awaiting some Elon Musk of the day to come forward and say, "Behold my new invention," but it never happened. And after 12 months and multiple mass sightings, they stopped. Another very relevant thing to consider is, why are they always covered in lights? In almost 90% of recorded cases, the object is described as really brightly lit or flashing different colours, or like the Hudson Valley one, you'll see the photo, it's a chain of almost fairy-like looking things going all around the outside of the craft. Now, to put it into human logic, there's only two conclusions that I can reasonably come to. One is that it's a byproduct of their propulsion system. Now, Bob Lazar, when he describes how the sports model that he worked on operates, says that it creates a very, very dense gravitational field, almost a bubble, that lenses light around the outside of it. He said that if you're underneath looking up at it, it's completely invisible. But also that it can appear different colours, just like the red shift at sunset. Now, a good example, if you want to have a look at that effect, would be looking at the black hole in Interstellar, where you see that corona of light around the outside. A sort of counterpoint which torpedoes that idea, though, is that we have already got optical camouflage technology. It's not just from Bond movies. We have developed photoreactive panels, and even in the consumer sector, you can now buy clothing which shears optics around it. So the idea that the NHI would have to create a UAP which can massively outperform anything that humans are capable of building, but has this weakness of being massively well lit, is just ridiculous, really. The only other reason is the same reason that we put coloured lights on Christmas trees. It's for display. It's to get your attention, or get the attention of the person or persons that it's displaying to. Now, Jacques Vallée and Diana Pasulka use the allegory of Plato's cave. Jacques Vallée also says it's like Japanese kabuki theatre with the stick puppetry or shadows on a wall. And I think the allegory of Plato's cave is perfect to show this display behavior. Now, the TED Talks YouTube channel did a much, much better and more concise job of summarizing Plato's cave. So what I've done, I know it's a little bit lazy, is I've cut a little clip out of it. So have a look at this and just bear in mind the UFO experience.
In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind, and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out.
So what conclusions can we draw? Well, frankly, I don't think we should draw any. I think drawing conclusions is one of the easiest pitfalls to fall into. Dr. Gary Nolan says that if you pin it all on a conclusion, you've only got to be wrong once and everything is wasted. Much better to focus on what you can control, which is good data collection. So it's easier to imagine this from a scale below us rather than trying to presume that we can understand the motivations and intentions of an immensely more complex being. I think about my little dog. She knows what my car looks like. She knows the sound of my voice. She knows what I look like. She knows the kind of things that I tend to do, but she doesn't understand my motivations. She doesn't know what tax is, for example, or the need to get a job, or finances, or why I collect guitars and things like that. So it's much easier to imagine the NHI from this perspective, something which has a totally alien, for want of a better word, set of motivations and purposes out there. And we, as long as we stay in our lane, which we seem to be doing because this thing has the capability to totally outperform anything militarily that we have, and yet seems to leave us alone, or seems to give us a little tap on the shoulder and say, don't do nuclear weapons, or appear to school children and say, stop polluting your world. So I guess we're a bit like the orangutans in this clip here, quietly working with a set of tools that have been given to us, unaware of the fact that there is somebody watching over our shoulder. So all we can do is continue to do our best. I know that's a little bit cheesy. Anyway, I hope you really enjoyed this video. It was a nightmare to make, I'm not going to lie, but I really enjoyed it, and I've learned quite a bit from it. If you did dig it, then drop me a like. That would be fantastic. I'm nearly at the point now where YouTube will buy me a squeaky toy for my dog, so that would be fantastic. See you soon.